Okay, here we go. So welcome everyone to this month's Fireside Chat, which has been co-hosted by the Turing Way and the Software Sustainability Institute. I am Sarah. I am part of the Community Management Working Group for the Turing Way. And I'll be kicking off this session just to tell you a bit more about the call before passing the mic to Malvika and Oscar, who have co-designed this series. So just a few words about the Turing Way. Most of you might know already, it is an open source, open collab, and community developed handbook on data science. Our main goal is just to make more reproducible, ethical and collaborative data science, and to make it both accessible and comprehensible for everyone. This Fireside Chat series itself has been an effort towards creating a space across open science communities and the wider ecosystem where people can gather and exchange concerns, explore challenges, and share just different practices that work in their context in order to build allyship and understand each other's works and perspectives just a little bit better. Malvika will probably tell you a bit more about this, but throughout 2025, we are hosting a special series of fireside chats about various topics, all related to governance. Today's topic is going to be what does governance mean to us in research and open science? So a pretty interesting one. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. We do have a shared Etherpad to facilitate written note-taking and invite ideas from you. I think it is being shared in the chat, so please feel free to just check in, go for the icebreaker, and make sure to post anything that can be used after. We do have a code of conduct that applies to this event to ensure accessibility and respectful collaboration. Any concerns, please report the incident. Any incident that makes you feel uncomfortable at this call or further ideas to improve accessibility as well are super welcomed. Please email us as the Turing Way at gmail.com or just reach out to me, Malvika, anyone in the Turing Way group will welcome your ideas. And again, just as a reminder, we will be holding a huge discussion, but also we will keep the Zoom room open for an additional 30 minutes after the discussion for an unrecorded and open discussion with everyone. Completely optional, but this is when usually we are able to turn off the recordings and ask questions of each other and ourselves in a less formal space, let's say. So with that, I am just going to hand it over to Malvika to kick off today's session. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm really excited that our community management working group is getting us all organized as we have transitioned out of the Turing Institute, although today is my last day and I'm joining from there. I'm Malvika Sharan. I am one of the steering committee member of the Turing Way. One of the ideas that Oscar and I have been working on alongside Ariel is to have the conversation on governance in the open, not just for the Turing Way, not just for SSI fellows, but people in our vicinity, in our neighborhood, in different projects who are thinking about the same topic. The reason to have this series of conversation now is that the Turing Way that used to be part of an institute is now out in the community, in the hand of people who have built this. And we are also trying to understand what does that mean from a governance perspective. So just to give one sentence about the governance, from my perspective, there are many definitions of this. Governance is a set of formal and informal practices through which an organization or a community or a team sets goals, assigns responsibility, establishes system, and assesses the outcome of organizational action. The governance body of the Turing Way currently is represented by the members of working groups and different projects. However, the governance is a very emerging, very evolving part of a project, because when the project changes, the governance needs to change, and it has to allow people's voices to occur. It has to create spaces for different decisions to be made in the public. So when we were having governance conversation in our community forum, there were a lot of interest from the community, and we didn't want to protect that conversation just for the steering committee. And we also understand that a lot of SSI fellows, a lot of open science communities are thinking about governance from different perspectives. They are at different stages of building their project. They're part of different communities. They're wearing multiple hats, and that sometimes gets very confusing. What does that mean to hold different governance responsibility in different spaces? So today we are starting our conversation with a very basic idea by asking some of the people who've been leading open science projects. They're working in research, they're working with funders, working with policymakers to talk about what governance means to them for open science and research. With that, I want to introduce my co-chair, Oscar, and invite him to introduce himself, and he will introduce our speakers. Over to you, Oscar.
Thank you very much, Malvika. Yeah, it's lovely to see everyone here. Thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Oscar Seip. I'm the Research Software Community Officer at the Software Sustainability Institute, and I run their fellowship program. So just a shout out, in August, applications will open up for that again. So if you want to make a difference in this space, please consider applying to that. I am very happy to introduce and have three very great speakers on this panel with a variety of backgrounds and perspectives. They've got a lot of experience in this space, so it'll be really interesting to learn from them. And I will allow them to introduce themselves and ask them a little bit as well which communities they've been involved with and what does governance mean for their respective communities. And I will start with Neil. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks very much, Oscar, and I'm delighted to be part of this chat. My name is Neil Chue-Hong. I'm director of the Software Sustainability Institute, and I'm based at the University of Edinburgh. I think for me, I've been involved in governance in lots of different ways. So I've previously been involved in a number of different open source software projects that have come out of universities. Now, obviously with the SSI, but also looking at governance for different sorts of funding programs and the things that they themselves produce. But on the other side, I've also had a lot of experience in government with charitable organizations. So those are both volunteer-led ones and staff-led ones, primarily in the area of kind of arts provision, but then also in things like student services. And I think in reflecting on all of this, I think Malvika gave a really lovely definition of what governance is and what it can do. But I think for me also governance goes beyond that. So it's not just the decision-making and accountability. It's also about the way that the entity that we're talking about here seeks to position itself in relation to the and it's almost always the humans that it interacts with. So it's kind of like channeling what the ethos is and what the values and brand are for an organization or an entity. And so from the sort of background of the different organizations I've worked with on governance and trying to reform governance in some of them, I think some of the kind of key aspects that are important are the people that you have in this process. Are they paid? Are they volunteers? Is it a mix? Is it focused on a product or service, or is it about creating a space and making that safe? And how do all of the different organizations that are involved in the governance, how do they interact? Is it more federated or is it more hierarchical? So I think just kind of finish up my intro. I think what's really interesting is that there's sort of two things that can change with governance through the years. So one is the participants, one of the people who are involved in the governance. And I think is very natural for that to change. And indeed, it's a good thing for that to change. But then sometimes there's also the case where you need to change the very structure of the governance itself. And one of the things that's always really interesting is knowing when to do that and whether or not you've done it too early, too late, or just at the right time. So thank you very much. And I'll pass back to Oscar.
Thank you very much. And a very important point about ethos there as well. And I should point out that in our previous seminar, we did discuss ethos and some of the values for the Turing Way as well. I should mention also, if you have any questions, thoughts, or comments, feel free to share them in the chat or in the notes document, and we will include them in the follow-up questions. So please add your questions there. Now moving on to Simon. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, yes. Oh, am I unmuted? Oh, yes, I am unmuted. That's good. Thank you, Oscar, and thank you very much for the invitation to come on this panel to talk about governance, which sounds like one of the least exciting things we could ever focus on, but it's really, really important, obviously. So, I'm Director of Strategy at the Software Sustainability Institute. I am the chair of the HiddenREF. That's my sort of day job. And the communities I've worked with have actually, again, it's really broad, as Neil was pointing out. So, I mean, the big ones, the ones that are very close to my heart, were the research software engineering community. We saw that grow from literally a handful of people through to its the size that it is now as an international community. I've worked with the HiddenREF community as well, which is, it's also a big community, but it's very different. And because it's actually bringing together already established groups and trying to get them to work with each other. And then obviously, you know, with the communities that we built around the SSI, all of these communities around things like training, the fellowship and stuff we worked with originally as well. So quite a range. And then even in going into, you know, the sort of the more difficult territory, I would see as being, which is the communities that exist within institutions. So within, you know, your own university. It's been very interesting to see how some of the big grassroots open movements that we've set up are differently governed to organizations within the university. They're smaller groups that are doing very important things, but only on a local scale. For me, I think, so like, basically, I don't really like governance. I think my sort of slightly anarchic sort of like preference is to have no governance, and we should all just just get on and do the right thing. But obviously the practical person inside you goes, oh well, yeah, we can't do that. We have to have some form of rules and regulations that sort of organize how this community works together to achieve the goals for that community. So I've always been really light touch on governance, and interestingly, I've seen that sometimes work really well and sometimes work really poorly. so I think, you know, constantly, every new community you work with, every new sort of change that you put into how you run a community, you're constantly learning and having to adapt. And so, and I can see that happening with the Turing right now. So I'm really interested in your direction in the future. And I think that's the summary of my work with communities and governance.
Thank you very much. A very broad sort of experience and governance within governance structures or within structures, within or change outside. Very interesting topics to talk about. Let me introduce our final panel member then. Riva, could you introduce yourself at your ready?
Hello, everyone. My name is Riva Quiroga. I'm based in Valparaíso, Chile. As of today, I'm working as a RSC doing like freelancing stuff, but tomorrow at the same time, I'll be joining the OLS team as a research fellow. I'm a serial volunteer, so I'm involved. I kind of jump into like every community that crossed my path. I'm a co-organizer of a rLadies chapter here. I'm starting an RSC community here in Chile, but I also have like roles in the leadership of two communities that I'm deeply involved. One is rLadies. I started as a chapter organizer, then I moved to the global team, and now I'm part of the leadership team. And I also collaborated at Programming Historian. I started like reviewing a translation, then I joined the team as an editor. Now I'm part of the board of trustees. And I think these two paths has allowed me to obviously understand that governance is this idea of the set of practices that ensure the organizational sustainability of a project. And that sustainability allows you to ensure the technical and financial sustainability. And also governance is in some way advocacy because it reflects to the world how you want people to get involved. For me, for example, I have a very different background. I'm living in a random country in the south of the world, but I was able to join Programming Historian because there were a clear path of how people can participate, how decision making was made. And at some point, it was a very open project. Like we didn't even have Slack or Discord. Everything was happening on GitHub. And that allowed people to understand how you can get involved, how decisions are made, and that make projects open, not only in the sense of open source, but also in welcoming people that maybe have like a diverse background. And that's a way you can, like, clear governance allow you to show those paths for people that might feel that that's not their place. But if you have that kind of structures, people can feel that they can join.
Thank you very much. That's a very important, interesting point as well. That governance structures isn't just about the structure and but it is how it's sort of the process of renewal as well. Simon touched on sort of adapting. Neil mentioned, this process of renewal as well. So it is governance is not this static structure that we're imposing at the start. It can be a communication, a dialogue constantly changing, but very open as well. And if anything, this seminar series makes you want to get into governance, I think that will be also an added benefit. If people think governance, that is really interesting, that's how I can make a change. That would be also great. I wanted to follow up with a question, but again, wanted to sort of iterate. If you have any questions for our speakers, please feel free to share them in the chat or in the notes documents. I can't see anyone yet, but I've got a follow-up question on, and we've touched a little bit on that. What kinds of governance structures have worked for your respective communities? And then reflecting on these different governance structures, what specific routes did you take to establish these governance structures? So it's how were they put in place, in bit by bit or all at once, and how does that reflect on your own experience or communities? And I'll start. Is anyone who wants to come in on that? Simon, yeah.
I can come in if they have. So the one that I think that's interesting here is the RSE community, and that's because it's got a lot of time behind it. So we really kicked the community off in 2013, and it's been growing ever since. What was interesting to me at the time was it was quite easy to get people involved in RSE. So I should say research software engineering. We all know what RSE is, but just in case, because it was a campaign fighting for a group that wasn't getting the recognition that they deserved, right? So we could get people involved in the governance of that community because we were saying there's a real delivery here for you. If we can get people together and fight this campaign and get recognition, you're going to make yourself have a nice sustainable career with a good direction and chances of promotion, and we'll be able to do that all at the same time as delivering something fantastic for research, which is a community of people who are going to be able to do the software well that the research relies on. So we had, often you will find, you're putting a community together and it's quite hard to get people into those sort of governing positions and to get working on how that community is going to be controlled, but people were really, really keen to do that. And it evolved over time. So when we kicked off, I was in charge and it was dictatorial, and that worked brilliantly in my estimations, but realized it wasn't very representative. So we first went out to the community really early. So we'd only been going for just over a year when we said, no, this is going to be a community-run organization, and we're going to do that to make sure that the community feels like they're being represented by their elected members. And so although we had elections, we were still very much kind of informal. And then, so finally, we had this informal way of sort of bringing people together, and we managed to pull off some really big things like running a conference and, running mentorship and things like those. And it wasn't until 2018 where we finally sort of set up a charity, and we had to put a proper governance structure in place, writing documents, sending them off to the charity commission to be reviewed and okayed. And the effect that I saw in the community there was that suddenly we had to deal with a lot of the questions that we were kind of possibly just ignoring, kind of like it's too big to deal with, and actually putting that formal governance in place made us deal with some of the big issues. So around, what do people get as being part of this community, and what happens if somebody disagrees with the direction that we're leading it in, and that was a real sort of eye-opener for me for taking a big community and having to put a formal structure into place. So I think RSE has been a really interesting case study for this because it's gone through so many changes in governance and is still going strong at the present date.
Thank you. And it's an important point as well about doing it in the open. So I really brought Malvika and the others from Turing Way to have these discussions in the open and to involve the community in that. And hopefully, as Simon said, that makes people more involved and feel like that the governance structure they'll end up with is one they've had input in. Any other thoughts on that, Neil?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's interesting from my perspective is many of the sort of governance structures I've been involved with have always been established already when I come in, but then they've evolved during the period that I have been participating in them. One thing I've been reflecting on has been around the way that the carpentries governance evolved in the early part of its formation. So I was involved in governance of carpentries from around about 2014 to about 2017. And that's a period where data carpentry was had established itself and was setting out. There was a lot of challenges to do with funding and also around things like understanding how the IP of what was being done for carpentries would be handled. And I think it's interesting to look at the way that the governance changed and adapted there. Partly, I think, because as Simon has sort of said, you do quite often get governance starting off as being a fairly light touch benevolent dictator in a lot of our open research projects, a lot of things coming in open source communities as well. And how you move beyond that, I think, is a mark of really establishing yourself as having an organization that really understands governance. Because I think for me, the big thing I realized when we were going through all of this with the carpentries is that you can be open and inclusive, but if your governance is not supporting that, then really you're only open and inclusive to some people, and then that's not open and inclusive. So you're transparent, you can be absolutely transparent, but you're not being inclusive. And I think governance really has to support that. And in the carpentries there was a real desire to start sharing responsibility. And again, in almost all of the volunteer-led organizations I've been involved with, I think the key thing that always comes up is if you don't give people responsibility early, then you don't keep them engaged. But if you don't have governance that helps ensure that they feel safe in terms of being accountable for that responsibility, then you don't keep them as soon as they make their first mistake. And actually, you want people to make mistakes. But if your governance doesn't support that, then what you find is you have people starting to kind of leave the organizations or being afraid to contribute. So it's tricky, isn't it? You want to be able to encourage people and you want to give them responsibility, but you need to come up with something, particularly as you're later on in life as an organization, where you may have a large amount of resources that need to be managed to ensure that people feel safe. So I think governance is also a safety net. And yeah, I think it's also something where a lot of open source projects don't necessarily get that right. And I can talk later on about my experiences of doing things through things like the Apache incubator process. But I'll hand back to you, Oscar.
Thank you very much. Yeah, interesting point about open and inclusive is not the same as transparent. I think that's a very important key message there. Riva, do you want to add anything to this?
Yes, I think my experience in rLadies and programming historian are very different because in the case of rLadies, the new leadership team kind of inherits the governance that was set before we like step in that role. And in the case of programming historian, I was part of the process of being just like random people working together to become a nonprofit and now a charity. So in the case of rLadies, basically the leadership team is also the board of directors of the nonprofit that is based in California. The former leadership team want to step down, all of them at the same time. So they established like a transition team where two people of the community, Saranjit and Yanni, they start like working on this transition process. But at some point, they just wanted to step down, and in the global team, they asked who want to just like step in as part of the leadership, and 5 of us we're serial volunteers, so we say, okay, we're going to do this. And I think we inherit like this way of working, of having like this leadership team, having the global team, and we're a federated community, which means that we have like our governance as a global community, but also each chapter is placed in a different part of the world, so they have their own governance, because we can like say people how to organize their community in Egypt or in Colombia, because the context is really different. And for us in this process, I think building trust has been one of the key part of making this work. So all of us 5, I have worked with a couple of them before. Other were people that I recently knew, and we've been almost like 3 years, and we meet like every week, because we realized that for us, like building the trust of working together was like the key part of making this work. And also formalizing more how the people can get involved in the global team. And in the case of programming historian, it was just a bunch of people grouped in publishing. Like at programming historian, what we do is that we're a platform that publishes open peer review tutorials for people in the humanities, social science libraries to learn about open science, open tools, and computational methods. And this was a very flat project. Like everyone was involved in every decision. At some point, this like works really well. But the issue with that is at some points, it makes very difficult sometimes to make decision, because you don't know how much you have to wait for people to like make an opinion. So we start like building very small blocks, like, okay, you have like 7 days to comment in this, make a comment in this issue if you agree or not. And at some point, the team start to grow. And we also realized that for make this project sustainable, like in a financial way, we need money. And manage money is not easy. Like at first, we thought that maybe someone's university can help us, but you probably all know that giving money to universities and trying to like ask them to manage the money is not easy. So we decide to go through the path of becoming a nonprofit. And obviously that will involve like changing the whole like way we organize ourselves, because it will split the project in two. Like the publisher, it will be like the nonprofit that offered the services to each publication. We're a multilingual project, so each language team, we will enable as a publisher of the nonprofit to them to do like their project. And obviously there are people that won't. You will lose people when you change the governance, because there are people that love a way of working and maybe they don't want to work in this new structure. And so we take like the route of becoming a nonprofit, and then we try to become a charity, and we fail at first, because sometimes when you like think that you know how to solve things with a computer, you think that, okay, we'll submit the papers for a charity and it will work, and we fail. So we have to ask people that actually know how to do these things to help us. And I think it has enabled us to, on the one hand, to receive money, because when we became a nonprofit, we designed this partnership program that allows institutions like libraries, universities, not other nonprofits, etc., to help us. And they have some kind of membership that also makes them part of the advisory board. And we hear their opinions when we need, to make some decisions or to start collaborations. And it has been really interesting, because it also has helped us on the one hand to kind of like secure the financial. Obviously it's not secure, but have like a structure of how we plan for the future. It allows us to have staff. We have like 2 people working for the project part-time. Also that allow us to kind of solidify a lot of the things that we have been doing in the past, but also have like every change in governance will limit things that you did before. Like previously people felt that they have like, people know everything that was going on in the project, and now things are a little more like encapsulated. Now we have a Slack, for example. So if you don't go to Slack, you don't know what's happening. And those stages are difficult. But I think if you want to think in the sustainability of your community, sometimes you have to make those decisions.
So what I'm hearing here a lot, and I'm trying to map some of that. First of all, just want to acknowledge what Anilda said in the chat. Thank you for your honest opinions and sharing examples. We've been talking about sustainability versus scaling, for example, in RSC community, right? Like how do you sustain a volunteer-led organization? And then intent versus possibility, intention of being inclusive versus are we really set up to be inclusive, the carpentries. And then I have been part of some places where change is not an option. People are not set up for change because they are volunteers, so they like familiarity, and sometimes people who like change have to just leave the governance because there's no possibility to evolve the process. And then some things that you all mentioned as well, that inheriting a governance versus having the agency to change that governance. So to that point, there's this idea of like, can we build that space where people do feel powerful, can advocate for change? And Oscar very beautifully framed this as renewal, as in like not thinking about evolving the older idea, but space for something new to happen. So can you think and share with us what aspects of governance help build that power, agency, and change through renewal? I'll let you take a break, Riva, and maybe begin with Neil.
Yeah, I was part of trying to address the governance of an organization, in this case around cinema provision to communities that had been around already for 60 years. So it was exactly what you mentioned, Malvika. There were a lot of people who were very satisfied with the current governance because it suited the way that they'd been doing things. Sometimes some of those people had been involved in this organization and really contributing a lot of great stuff for 40 years. But the problem was not them. The problem was that the environment around had completely changed. And I think the challenge there was that the sorts of things that the governance structure needed to do were no longer suited for the environment that we were working in. And I think that kind of manifested itself in two forms. So the first one was we realized that we didn't have a way of incorporating different types of skills and experiences that we needed now that we didn't probably need 10 years ago, certainly not 20 years ago. And then the other thing was that the way that the governance had been set up to do worked very well with the types of organizations that had been set up in the past, but wasn't reflective of the new types of organizations that were seeking to become part of this community space. And so I think that's kind of, in terms of renewal, I think that's a really important thing, is I always think for governance that you should be regularly reviewing it. And you can actively decide that you're not going to change things, and that is perfectly fine, but you've got to actively decide that. And I think one of the really important things that we found was trying to understand why we were doing the governance. So in this case, it's about communication of knowledge, and it's about making sure that decisions that are being made that will impact all of the individual constituent parts of the organization would reflect the requirements and desires from these different constituent parts. As we got a much wider diversity of these different constituent parts was important. So it was really difficult to make sure that we socialized the reasons why we were making the changes, the reasons why it looked like we were bringing in outside people, and the benefits of that. And it was really hard. I think one of the big challenges that we saw there was that it's very easy to get stuck in a velvet rut. It's something that's very kind of comforting. It's sort of, it works well for the existing group of people, but it doesn't allow your organization to evolve. And for this, the kind of key one was a realization that there were a whole load of people who were doing things in a completely different way, but whose goals and aims and outcomes were exactly the same as the people who had been doing it for 40 years. And so how did we adapt the governance there? And a lot of that was just about understanding why each of these different organizations wanted to be members of this umbrella organization, and also what level of power they wanted in terms of the decision making. And I think once that was satisfied, then the evolution began. So yeah, it's hard, but it's always possible with dialogue.
In some sense, this is why we have things like board of directors or steering committee, or like a group of responsible people who can manage that balance between taking it slow so other people can understand what's happening, but then finding, pushing forward so we don't get stuck in this constant deliberation and not really doing anything in a structured way. Simon, what's your thought on this?
So the thing I'm thinking about here is, it's actually based on a point that Neil made earlier on about, it's one thing to have a process where supposedly anybody can engage and change things, but actually you have to make sure that you're open to that engagement, right? So, but building on that, one of the things that we've constantly struggled with all of the communities that I've ever been involved in, and it's like, how much information do you give to everybody so that they feel like they're empowered to make decisions, right, against how much time you've got to take up for them to actually understand everything that's required to make that decision. And we're constantly balancing it out, and you'll get criticized because you put too much information out there and people say, I can't possibly understand all of this, come to a decision. You'll also get criticized for not putting enough out there. So one of the things we've dealt with a lot is trying to get that balance right. And so you'll see it with things like, so the Society of Research Software Engineering is having trustee elections at the moment. And obviously we want people to come in and to nominate themselves and then stand to be a trustee, but we've got to give them enough information about how much time that's going to take, the kind of responsibilities you'll be taking on, the stress that's involved in that position. You are responsible partially for an entire charity that's running this community across the country and parts of other countries as well. So you're trying to give them enough information so they know what they're getting into, enough information so that they can understand what their role will encompass, but not so much that they give them the impression that this will be a terrible thing, and that it'll just be a whole lot of work. And the other aspect actually is that it's such a hugely rewarding thing to do, and you're trying to get that point across at the same time. But you tend to, because you're usually doing this at the end of your time as a trustee, you tend to focus on the and this, and all the issues. So I think I think it's absolutely important, and certainly all the communities I've been involved in have been very open and transparent communities where we try and get everything out there so people can understand why we're making decisions and how those decisions are being made, right? But understanding that just being open isn't actually giving people accessible information. You've got a job to do to boil that down in a way so that people can be empowered to make those decisions. And then getting that balance right of talking about the responsibilities and the joys, and like not overlooking the absolute joys of being part of something like Turing Way, like RSE, like any of these things, because it's a hugely rewarding thing to take part in. If you can get that balance right, then I think you've got the basis for a really sort of strong governance model to be underpinning a particular community. But it's not easy.
I really appreciate it. I was for a year part of Society of RSE Trustee, and what I learned was amazing. Like the amount of documentation internally they have, if all the people had access to that, that'd be amazing. But what point you made is so true, is that when you give too much information, it's just too much for people. It's not super accessible because most of these are legal documents in some sense. But yeah, I had hoped that one day I would be able to help open up those documents so other people can use it. But I definitely took some of those processes in OLS, and it really helped me. And I was thinking about, like, isn't it lucky for us to be able to sit in different places, learn from these different places, and really pick and choose what works, what doesn't. coming to you, Riva, I'm going to add one thing to that idea of power and collective, because you said that in rLadies, you know, when people have to step up, there are people who are probably very active and feel quite confident or feel like, yes, they have capacity or knowledge, can step up. Do you see some pathways for people who would generally not see themselves in these kind of roles to still have opportunity to add to the governance? What processes do you think you can share from your so many projects that you're part of?
Yeah, in the case of rLadies, one thing that we've been trying to work like in the past 3 years is how get people involved in the global team. The global team is kind of, they're the people who like manage the social and technical infrastructure so chapters can work throughout the world. And one thing that we realized, and it was like maybe because of our experience joining the global team, for example, I was 1 year in the global team before becoming part of the leadership team, and I never have a meeting with anyone. And someone told me, well, there's documentation for this, but I didn't know how to use the documentation, how to become the people that can use the documentation properly. Because I don't know, there was a password that I didn't know how to access to. And so what we've been trying to do in the global team is designing pathways so people with very different like patterns of time commitment can participate. Maybe there's someone that have, I don't know, Fridays after 3 hours every Friday afternoon to like commit to the project. There's some things that they can do, but they can, for example, be monitoring the Slack in case there's something is happening there, because you can wait. If something happened on Monday, you can't wait until Friday to like solve an issue. So we've been trying to be very transparent with people who have some kind of interest in joining the global team, what kind of roles they can take, where they can make an impact, and they can make decisions about how they can like design new things for the community that match the amount of time and the availability that they have. And some people have, I don't know, a bunch of time, one time a month. There are some people that prefer to work, I don't know, 10 minutes every day. And we try to have like pathways for everyone to get involved and also to take ownership of their role. Like, we know that it's called like the leadership team, but that doesn't mean that we have to like make the decision of what every team is doing. We want people to have ownership of what they want to do. Like if they want to like pursue a new project within the community that will serve like all the chapters, we're very happy to do that. But we also were very cautious of, because when you start something, sometimes you're very enthusiastic and want to do a lot of things. And for example, from time to time, someone says, okay, we need to have a newsletter, you know, that will be awesome, great, newsletter are awesome. But if you want to start a newsletter, you need to be sure that you will be able to sustain it on time. So you also have to be like very responsible in terms of how you think of the change and renewal, but also how you can sustain that on time. So new efforts are not like disappear over time.
Okay, thank you. I just have a question from the chat. A quick question for Simon. Actually, you know, you mentioned an architect structuralist project. As someone was wondering, you know, where have you seen that work well, and do you think there are specific qualities for projects that lend themselves to
No,
this more structure?
I've never seen it really work well. So the problem is, I was saying basically at the start that an anarchic structuralist, you know, everybody's in it to make the world a better place thing is what like close to my heart. That's how I think communities should run. But I actually find that I've never seen one of those run very well. Usually you need some guidelines in place so people, you know how decisions are made and know how to contribute. So as much as I would like to see that too, you know, there's some happy anarchy somewhere. I've not seen it personally, but I might be alone. Maybe like Neil or Riva have seen some sort of utopia out there. No, it's not looking good. It's not looking good.
Sure, we would describe this as utopia.
No, I'm kind of thinking about it, and that sounds like a dystopia. It's basically making some sort of environment where things work because people tell you that they should work rather than enabling people to participate. So yeah, I'm the opposite. I feel like without governance, nothing can scale past 2 people.
Well, that brings us, as we're sort of nearing the last 15, and I want to leave 5 minutes for a closing statement, to a sort of final question. Why do we do this? Why is governance important? Neil touched on that earlier as well, and I think Riva mentioned as well. And I wonder if our panel members can sort of respond to that. Why is governance important, and specifically for researchers, fellows, and members in open science, but just generally speaking as well? Riva, would you like to come on that?
I think if you want people to participate in your project and you want to build trust, you need to have some kind of governance. So I think the why will be because you care about people. Like the anarchy of like the no governance. Yeah, maybe for 2 people, maybe a household can manage that. But if you have a community, you want people to join. And like as an introvert, I'm very bad at speaking with people that I don't know. But when I join a community that have a governance and I know like what are the paths for me to participate, I find that super rewarding. So I think the why will be because you want to allow people with different backgrounds to participate, because you want people to feel that they can like impact the community in a way, and that their opinions will be valuable. So I think if you care about people, you want people to join the project, and you want your project to be sustainable in the long run, you need to have some kind of governance.
Yeah, thank you. And that's sustainable is in my experience tied into with that process of renewal. If you have a governance structure by a lot of people who set it up and then at once they all leave without proper documentation, then who's going to follow that? Neil or Simon, would you like to, or the anarchic discussion is still going on in the chat. Feel free to answer on the why or how.
Yeah, I'm kind of picking up on what Riva said. I think it is that idea of being able to scale. And the other thing I think for me, the why we do governance is otherwise we won't be able to evolve, because governance is the structure that lets us evolve in a way that is safe. And it's also a way that can evolve in a way that allows us to inspect what we need as an organization or an entity. So I think if we don't have governance, we can't have those conversations in a way that lets us kind of adapt and evolve. And so let's do that. Let's make sure we become butterflies by mixing everything up and creating a completely new thing. And governance allows us to do that.
I'll add to that I think the governance systems we put in place, they're like the least worst ways of making decisions. Like it's you need those rules to be able to make the decisions. And to pick up on Riva's point, actually, I couldn't agree with more. And so if we don't have the rules about how a decision is made for a community, then the loud voices do tend to prevail. And the people who are willing to come back in and keep hammering their particular point. And some of those people, I'm also an introvert, which is a very untenable position for somebody who runs communities a lot, but hey ho. So some of those people who are more extroverted and are fighting their cause, they are fighting the good fight, but sometimes they are just representing their own particular views on a subject. So you need governance to make sure that you hear that entire breadth of different opinions and ideas, because it's only when you draw on the full breadth of your community that you can make the best decisions. So yeah, governance, least worst form of making decisions.
Thank you. That almost sounds like democracy, the least worst.
Exactly.
So thank you, everyone. I'll pass on now to Malvika for the closing statements for the formal section.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we have about 5 minutes. So there's this question, which I think, Neil, you already touched on, that sometimes change is needed because environment is changing. And some of us are attending Meta Science conference, and Meta Science is like really talking about AI in all the places because everybody's talking about that. In terms of thinking about why we should care about governance from researchers' perspective, which is something that we have vaguely touched on, but I think it would be useful to probably iterate or give a clear definition for why should early career researcher or people in research who are not seeing themselves part of these communities or bigger organization care about governance? What is the relevance of governance for them? Especially, I know, Neil, you work in research context as well, and all of us have worked, but like, what would you advise a fellow?
Sorry, we've got the meta science break happening now, and I missed the last half of what you said there.
As in, why should researchers engage with the topic of governance, even when they don't see themselves part of these communities or organization or part of, like, steering committee kind of role?
And here, do you mean researchers who are interested in researching the organizations, or researchers who are interested in participating in the organizations?
Could be any. I think I'm thinking more from my perspective. When I was early career researcher as a PhD student, didn't really think about governance much until I had to, because I wanted to do some changes and I felt powerless and I needed to figure out where the power sits. Should I have known earlier?
Yeah. So I'll answer from the perspective of the governance of things like funding programs. So I had an early break in terms of sitting on some of the advisory committees and governance boards for some of the funders. And I've continued this and a part of some of the things that are around investment. And I think one of the things that I really learned that was very useful early on was that it's a bit like what Simon said. It's often the case that you want to kind of make things transparent, but many of the things that you might make open and available without the context and without someone able to talk you through it can be very impenetrable, or you can misunderstand. So I think becoming actually involved in the governance procedures, structures, committees, and so on gives you an insight into the information that you might find available as an early career researcher, but you can't set it in that context. So I would always go and say to early career researchers, do get involved in the governance of something that's maybe not necessarily really close to your heart. Obviously, do that because you want to do that as something contributing back to the community, but also get involved in the governance of something which is adjacent to what's close to your heart. Because then you really get a sense of why people might find particular things important, and also why things are done in a particular way that you might not agree with, but there will always be a historical reason for why it was done that way. And having that context can really help you project forward into understanding how you make decisions yourself as someone involved in governance.
I think you're still muted, Malvika.
Sorry, I'm in a room and have different power. So it's definitely bringing now to the closing statement, now that the Turing Way and a lot of communities and organizations who are going through changes in their governance process, what advice would you have for them? And I know, Riva, you just got your second cup of coffee this morning, so I'll start with you.
No, it's tea. Like, I already have the morning coffee. So I think are there two things? One thing that was very helpful for us at Programming Historian was at first our board of trustees were all people involved in the project. And last year we onboarded someone that has nothing to do with the project, but has some skills that we know we were lacking. And it has been super useful to have these people asking questions that we haven't asked in a lot of time, or things that we thought that were obvious for us because we've been in this for years. That has been super helpful. And the other thing is, sometimes you think that everyone in the team knows what the project is about. For example, we're currently making a very big decision regarding our infrastructure. And while discussing, we realized that we have like very different visions or conceptions of what this project is about. And we realized that before making the decision, maybe we need to agree very clearly what are our values, what are our guiding principles, what is the vision of the project for the next 5 years, and then make the decision taking into account that agreed set of principles and vision and guiding values that we want to have. We thought we kind of agreed because we've been involved in the project for so many long time. But while discussing this, like very critical about changing our infrastructure, we realized that our idea of what this project is or what it meant for the community, it was very different. So setting those kind of guiding principles are very useful, because every time you need to make a decision, you can go back to that and see, okay, this is like according, this is okay. No, this has nothing to do with what we thought we were doing.
Thank you, Riva. Simon.
I'm trying to think of so I always feel like I should give you something big and strategic, you know, at these stages. But actually, the thing that's helped me absolutely the most when dealing with governance in different institutions has been something really straightforward, and that is that you know, we as a species are incredibly good. We can speak for hours, you know, without actually ever fully understanding what it is we're talking about, because we're slightly embarrassed by the fact that we don't understand it, or we weren't listening at the right point, or whatever. And I think one of the biggest things that have helped in governance discussions when I've been in different groups is having the confidence to ask the stupid question, you know, and saying, like, so this is about shifting that decision from us to the community, right? So like, and so everybody gets their opportunity to just level out on that. And then I've found that is the most empowering thing you can do in these kind of discussions, by just allowing people the ability to sort of take a step back and go, right, what is it we're actually doing here? So I wanted to give you something big and strategic, but instead I'm giving you something tactical, but something that has paid back so many times throughout my career.
Simple is good, and that's a really fantastic advice. Thanks, Simon. Neil.
Okay, so I'm going to say something which is maybe interesting in terms of a lot of the communities like Turing Way and others, which are effectively grassroots communities. So there's been a lot of research in the UK in terms of charity governance that basically goes, in terms of your top level governance for a charity, you should have no more than 50% of the people be from that, directly from that community and benefiting from that community, because otherwise you can't have the objectivity to be able to see the way forward. So I think the kind of bit of advice that I would give around here is, you don't necessarily need to go that far with the Turing Way, but I think this is the time to reflect on what are the voices, what are the experiences, what are the talents that you think you need as a community for the next 3 to 5 years, and then how do you persuade people that they should be giving up their time to the Turing Way to get those new voices in? And that's hard, but it also tells you something about where you want to go. And I think that is in itself such a wonderful exercise to do as a community.
That is beautiful. Thank you so much, Neil. So we've reached the end of the recorded part, and I know, Simon, you'll have to drop. So I want to thank all the speakers for coming along and sharing their experiences. This is a very beautiful recording that we'll come back to and take a lot of notes from. So a recorded round of applause before we go to the unrecorded part. Thank you all for joining this conversation. We're going to stick around for another half an hour. I love the new Zoom has a lot of emoji that's like floating around my whole screen. So we're going to stop recording here. Thanks so much, Oscar. Of course, Oscar. I couldn't have put this together without. So thanks so much, Oscar.
Thank you.